Okay, good evening. I'm recording this the day after I uploaded the video on whether or not aliens would be safe to eat, and I'm pleasantly surprised by how well it seems to be doing, because in my mind it was a relatively simple, quick, kind of light-hearted video to give me something to work on and upload while I was busy with the much bigger series that I have planned for later in the year. And it's only kind of tangentially related to the stuff I usually talk about, so I really wasn't expecting it to do very well. But at this rate, it's actually on track to be my fastest growing video ever, which is a nice surprise. The next video is almost certainly going to be the first episode in the domestication/agriculture series that I've been working on. At this point, the hardest part is still trying to decide exactly how to divide up the episodes and what topics to include in each one, because all the various topics of agriculture and domestication and sedentism and early civilizations all kind of blend into each other and interdepend on each other to a certain extent. So it's kind of hard to decide how to tackle those topics individually. But I am trying my absolute hardest to make sure that each of the episodes are relatively small and manageable, so we don't accidentally recreate the vast, hulking behemoth that was Alien Biospheres. But anyway, before then, I would really like to get the grammar of this language finished. So, in so doing, let us give our customary thanks to the patrons for their continued support, and then let's jump back in. So, a couple of points of follow-up. Number one, last time we were working on coordination and we came up with this proclitic, and I was trying to decide whether or not it could be used for verbal coordination as well as nominal coordination. But the more I thought about it, the more I think I do want it to be isolated to just nominal coordination, because that helps it feel more sort of defined, and it separates it a bit more from the way that and works in English. Whereas for verb phrases and clausal coordination, you would just use these converb forms, where you just take the suffix achin, and you just stick it onto the end of the first principal part to mean and doing such and such, and you put it onto the end of the third principal part to mean and then doing such and such. And the main reservation I had about doing that last time was the exception of afterthoughts, like if the converb form has to come first before the finite verb, then what if it only occurs to you to add a coordinated verb phrase afterwards? But I think it's perfectly reasonable to say that you just use a dummy verb like to do. In fact, hold on. Yeah, so we've got this verb that just means to do or to make or to carry out, just a very simple, semantically weak verb. So you could just take a verb like that and stick achin at the end of either the first or third principal part, and then there you go. So if you wanted to say something like, I went to the shop and bought milk, oh, and I saw my friend there too, and that second clause, oh, and I saw my friend there too, to introduce that clause, you would use the first principal part of this word, so hin, with the simultaneous ending. So it would be hin, and then the rest of the clause would follow. So it's kind of like a little sort of afterthought particle, or a word that specifically means that and such, but only in the context of verbal and clausal coordination. And speaking of the consecutive, it occurred to me after recording the last episode that the consecutive converb could also be used as a sort of immediate past, like with our tense aspect mood matrix, with the third principal part here. The third principal part definitely has the most sort of past-y association with it, but if you used one of these constructions and then stuck the achin ending onto the end of the third principal part, then they would all have the same meanings but have a sense of an immediate past to them, like the action has just now happened, because the achin ending comes from the phrase that means at the moment of, and the third principal part ending comes from the word from. So if you wanted to say, I just saw my friend, then that would be etymologically kind of like, I exist at the moment from seeing my friend. Like 1 moment has passed from seeing my friend. I saw them 1 moment ago. So that's a fun little bit of nuance that we can add. Also, last time I consistently referred to this yak ending as the resultative converb. I don't really know why I did that. I guess it was just resultatives were on the brain. But the actual term I meant to say was causal. This is a causal converb. It indicates the cause of why the action happened. So like, following from such and such would mean because of such and such. However, it's also reasonably common for causal converbs to overlap to some degree with anterior converbs, after such and such. And, I think you can see why, because the expression of following such and such could also just mean afterwards. It comes back to the old logical fallacy of post hoc ergo propter hoc. A came before B, therefore A must have caused B. Humans are quite susceptible to thinking along those lines. So I think we'll throw in that the causal can also be used as a sort of general anterior in some situations. And then when it comes to the concessive, I've shortened it up ever so slightly, because last time we were using the gerund as the stem, and then just stuck sinta afterwards, so it was like sinta. But I decided that, with frequent use it would get shortened up a bit, and that H in that position, since that syllable isn't being stressed, I could see the H disappearing. And at that point, we could either say that palatal stop will have become an S by that point, in which case later on it would roticize, so we would get urinta as the ending, which is exactly the same as the second principal part, just with inta stuck on the end. Or we could say that the H disappears early on enough that the palatal stop hasn't become an S yet, and therefore when it comes between vowels, it will disappear, or rather it will turn into a y, which melds in with the following e, and then the u and the e merge together into a long e, so it would just become inta, but it would also front the preceding vowel. I'm kind of on the fence about that, but I do like shortening things up when given the opportunity. Yeah, I think I'm going to go for it for now. Okay, last bit of follow-up that will lead us directly into what we're doing today. So last time I asked you all whether or not you cared about seeing me work out declensions and conjugations on air, and the results were more or less unanimous. Pretty much everyone voted to see the declensions and conjugations being worked out in an actual episode, and that is fine by me. So I think what we're going to do, we're going to save that for the last episode before we start working on the writing system. That'll be our way of sort of tying a nice little bow on the grammar, which means that our task today is to try and get through as much of everything else as possible, which is a little bit of a tall order, but I think it should be doable. Worst comes to worst, I might have to record one extra episode. So I think the first thing we're going to tackle today is the issue of resultatives. Because last time I mentioned that I'd not really looked into the cross-linguistic patterns in how different languages handle resultatives. And after that episode, someone by the name of William Palmer, I believe, pointed me in the direction of this paper, A Cross-Linguistic Perspective on Resultative Formation, which was a very interesting read, and from that starting point I got led down a research rabbit hole, which, along with a conversation I had with my good friend Karas Soowon, led me to discover the wonderful world of secondary predication, which is something that I was not particularly familiar with beforehand. So secondary predication primarily involves two different but related constructions. One are resultatives, which, like I mentioned last time, are things like, I painted the fence white. So there is a change of state occurring, where the fence has become white as a result of my painting. And the other construction is called a depictive, which is something like, I went to bed hungry. Now the difference is that in a depictive, there is no change of state occurring. It's not like the act of me going to bed made me hungry. The state of being hungry is sort of consistent throughout the whole action. Now, another very interesting difference between these constructions is that, at least in English, resultative constructions must always specifically refer to the direct object. So like, I painted the fence white. It is unambiguously the fence that is becoming white in this construction. There's no way anyone could interpret this to mean, I painted the fence so that I became white. You could potentially interpret it as a depictive, so like, I was white while I was painting the fence. But there's no way that you could interpret this as a change of state that has happened to the subject. And because of this constraint, if you're trying to use a resultative construction with an intransitive verb, then sometimes you have to use what they call a fake object or fake reflexive construction. So to use an example from one of the papers I read, if you use a verb like to dance, which is intransitive, you can't say I danced saw. That's just not grammatical. at least as a resultative. I guess you could interpret that as a depictive, where I was already sore before I started dancing. But if you wanted to say, I danced so that I became sore, to use that as a resultative construction, there needs to be a direct object, even though dance is intransitive. So what you can do is you say, I danced myself sore, where even though ordinarily you wouldn't ever say, like, I danced myself, just to make this construction work, you throw in a reflexive. Or you can throw in a dummy object, like, I danced my feet sore, like I danced so that my feet became sore. Now, this paper does bring up the direct object restriction. It doesn't mention exactly how cross-linguistically common the direct object restriction is, but it does mention that, at the very least, in Korean, Finnish, and Tamil, the direct object restriction does not apply. Like this example from Korean, where it's like, Chris shouted, fainted. So that's all quite interesting. And there were a bunch of comments on the last episode of people talking about how resultatives are handled in languages that they're familiar with. And I was a bit surprised how often it seems that an adverbial construction is used. Because I would think, in this instance, the adjective is applying specifically to a particular noun. So I would have thought there would be some benefit to treating it as an adjectival construction and potentially having agreement or some such thing. But I suppose, if there is a direct object restriction present, then that doesn't really matter, because you have to interpret it as going with the direct object. But then I don't know how you distinguish that from depictives. But in any case, for this language, we have established that there is a very productive adverbial suffix. So I think for either one or both of these constructions, that would be a pretty solid option. So like, there would be no difference between I went to bed hungry and I went to bed hungrily. Or, if you wanted to be a little bit more explicit, I guess you could just use some adposition. Like, you could use this preposition wird, which means in or inside. So it would be the equivalent of I went to bed in hunger, which even in English that's perfectly allowable. You know, you can say something like, he stormed out of the room in anger. You know, it's extremely common cross-linguistically to describe states as locations, or as sort of places to exist within. And then thinking about it, we could potentially use this other adposition, yat, that means into, to describe resultatives. I painted the fence into white. Or we could just use this word ba, which means toward. I painted the fence to white. So I think using a postposition would probably be the simplest and easiest option. But, alternatively, an option that did occur to me is if we turn the adjective into a verb, which we can do because we've got this suffix that can be applied to nouns or adjectives to turn it into a verb that means to become such and such, and then we applied a resultative converb to that, then we would end up with something that means I painted the fence so that it became white. Or, as my good friend Jake Penny pointed out in the comment to the last episode, we could just restructure the clause so that it becomes I whitened the fence by painting, in which case we would take the adjective white, put the become verbalizing suffix at the end, then add a causative, and have that be the main verb of the clause. So that would make a verb that means to whiten, and then the verb that means to paint would be put in an instrumental converb. And all of these could potentially be options. Like, there doesn't necessarily need to be just one specific way that resultatives are expressed. But it does feel to me like the become suffix is a little bit more marked of a way of doing it, so I think most of the time I'll just stick with the postpositional strategy. Of course, we don't currently have a resultative converb, but that is something that we will talk about hopefully later this episode. So as far as I can tell, that's basically all we really need to do when it comes to resultatives and depictives. The only remaining thing is to settle on whether or not there is actually a direct object restriction when it comes to resultatives, and I think I just need to do some more research on just how widespread that is before I can make that decision. I am going to go ahead and cross that one off the list. Okay, next up, I actually want to return to the subject of person clitics. Because I mentioned, I think it was in the last episode, because this is something that came up during the conversation I had with Harry Cook about how to deal with reflexives and the middle voice, etc. And yeah, the more I've thought about it and the more I've looked into things, I think I actually am going to go with person clitics. Not only because I love it when the direct object can be incorporated in some way into the verb, but also because there's some very interesting stuff going on in the realm of clitics that I was not aware of previously. And also, with some of these pronouns, if you recall, I had thought that some of them were a bit long and clunky and wanted to reduce them further, and if we say that we're clitics, we can actually get away with doing that. So first of all, in terms of positioning, clitics will generally have one side of the verb that they preferentially or exclusively attach to. And in this instance, I would imagine that it would have to be on the left, because this language is consistently verb final, or at least the lexical verb always comes at the end. I guess we could say that pronouns, since they're not particularly salient, they could just be stranded at the end, but I think I would actually prefer them to come on the left anyway. Now, one other thing I'll bring up at this point, something else that briefly came up during that talk I had with Harry, and that I have been doing some reading up on, is what are called PCC effects, which stands for Person Case Constraints. And this is basically, in many languages, if you have a construction that involves multiple person clitics within the same clause, like, for example, in a ditransitive construction, there will be certain restrictions on what combinations of clitics are allowed based on both person and case. So I've been reading a bunch of papers on the subject, and this one, the Person Case Constraint, the syntactic encoding of perspective, nicely delineates what the various options are. So in languages with the so-called strong PCC, like French for example, in a clitic construction, the direct object has to be third person. And I think the way it's resolved if the direct object isn't third person is you just can't use the clitic form, you just have to use the independent form of the pronoun. Whereas Italian, I believe, just has the so-called weak PCC, which means that the direct object only needs to be third person if there is a third person argument, whereas in French it always has to be third person no matter what. And this just seems to be related to the whole person hierarchy concept from direct inverse languages, where there's just a natural tendency to place more emphasis on speech act participants, etc. And so certain categories of pronoun just become more or less associated with the verb than others. And this paper also brings up the fact that apparently in Layista Spanish and in Mohawk, there's an additional constraint based on animacy, which is very interesting. And again, that just makes perfect sense. Just generally speaking, inanimate nouns are much less likely to have prominence placed on them, so they're more likely to just get associated with the verb. Now, I think I still need to do a bit more reading on the subject to wrap my mind around some of the subtleties of this. But at this point, I think I might either go with the strong PCC or the hilariously named ultra-strong PCC, which I don't know why it's called that, because to me it seems less strong than the regular strong, because the direct object has to be either second or third person, and a third person argument has to be the direct object. So it seems like kind of a halfway between the strong and the weak, so I don't know why it's called ultra-strong. But in any case, I kind of like the idea of having some fairly rigid constriction, because takvamir has a lot of valency changing operations, not only the middle voice but a whole bunch of applicatives, so it would be very easy to restructure the arguments so that the required case and person could end up in clitic position. I think I still need to do a little bit more reading before I make a firm decision on that front, but in the meantime, we can certainly start making some forms for these clitics. Okay, so unless I am missing something, I can't really think of any context in which we would ever need nominative clitics, because we already have subject marking on the verb. So as far as I can think, any time you used a nominative pronoun, it would automatically be in the independent form. Unless there were specific nominative subject clitics for converbs, because converbs don't otherwise take subject marking. But I don't think I want to do that. Might think about that a bit, but I'm pretty sure I don't want to do that. Now, for the accusative, locative, and dative, something else we have to consider, yet again, is vowel harmony. Depending on what stage in the language's history these pronouns become clitics, we could say that vowel harmony either does or does not apply. And on the one hand, if it doesn't apply, that makes it feel more like these are clitics rather than straight up affixes. And it helps to sort of get across that these are in fact separate words that are just sort of leaning on the verb. But on the other hand, I do kind of want to use vowel harmony where I can, because this language does not actually have very much affixation going on. and most of the time when it does, it's fusional, so you don't get the Turkish situation where you get great long agglutinated strings of affixes, and the vowels harmonize all the way down the line. Most of the time you just get one suffix or one prefix, whereas in this case we could theoretically end up with a verb that has an applicative prefix, and a passive prefix, and an object proclitic. So up to 3 prefixes in a row, and it would be quite fun to say that harmony applies regressively just all the way through that string. Yeah, I think I might actually go with vowel harmony. Might change my mind about that later, but for now I'm going to go with vowel harmony. So for example, this first one here, the first person singular accusative form, the protoform would be something like nidasu, and I had reduced that all the way down to nis, just because I was trying to shorten it up as much as possible. But we could say that the independent form is a little bit less reduced, and it preserves the old d, so it would be like nadis, whereas the clitic form becomes more reduced and becomes something like nas. And in fact, while I'm at it in the nominative here, we're not worrying as much about reducing it to be as short as possible. I think it's actually more likely that it would just end up as nid. Oh, and this is fun, because in the first person plural, since it becomes a proclitic long before word final vowel loss and the epenthetic vowel, etc., then the s wouldn't roticize, and it would just be taska. Now with this second person plural, I'm very tempted to get rid of that geminate, and just say that the clitic is just kas, and I think would be justified in doing that. I'm struggling to decide how to handle this one, because the protoform would have been takahin. If we say it cliticized early enough, then the k and the h could have just been skipped over, so it would have become like tain, and then that diphthong would later monophthongize, so it would just become teen. But it does look kind of weird, with a geminate in the independent form, and nothing in the clitic form. The only other option I can think of is to just say that the clitic is identical to the independent form, but I would prefer to reduce it if possible. I'll have to think about that, and I can't really think of any way to reduce this one. I mean, I guess these are the locative forms of the verbs, they're not going to be used all that often, except in imperatives, because the imperative form of the verb requires the object to occur in the locative, so that's something to keep in mind. Okay, so I think those are all the forms. There are these ones in the locative that I still don't know how to handle. Particularly this one in the human plural, because I really feel like that one should be reduced as much as possible, because it's going to come up all the time. But this form törin is just so clunky, I just can't think of how to reduce that any further. The only option I can think of is if that geminate r gets skipped over, and it just becomes tan, but then that would make it identical to the human singular. Which I guess isn't that bad, because you could just use the independent form of the pronouns to specify if need be. Yeah, okay, I'll leave it like that for now then. So going back to PCC effects, if we went with the strong PCC, then that means in a multiclitic construction, then the direct object proclitic would always have to be one of these. So most of the time it would either be tas or tar, and that s in tas is going to roticize if the verb it's attaching to begins with a vowel or just any voiced sound. So it's going to be a lot of tar, whereas if we go with the ultra strong, then that would include the second person as well. So that would give us a little bit more variety. Yeah, I'm going to think about it a bit more, but at this point I'm leaning towards ultra strong. Okay, so with the exception of those few final decisions, which I'm going to have to do some more reading on, that's person clitics done. So that means the only thing we have left to do today are conditionals and clause chaining. So let's do conditionals, because I don't think that'll take very long. So we already have a specific tense, aspect, mood combination for a conditional, which could also equally be considered like a general irrealis hypothetical type thing. But that is just for the apodosis, the would clause, like I would see my friend today. But we currently don't have anything worked out for how to say the if clause, like if it wasn't raining, I would see my friend today. So we need a way of expressing the concept of if, and more than likely that will be something that is tackled by a converb. So we need a conditional converb. So as I think I brought up last time, conditionals are sometimes related in some way to the concessive, in ways that I don't really understand. Like in Manchu, the conditional is identical to the concessive, except with the accusative stuck on the end. And I remember coming across several other examples of the same sort of thing. To me, a pathway that makes more sense is to use some sort of locative morphology. So like if I were to say, if I see my friend today, I will be happy. That could be expressed as upon seeing my friend, or in the event of seeing my friend. So you frame the protasis as the location or the event at which the apodosis happens. Now we've already used our locative case, which used to be the accusative case, for the first principle part, but we could potentially say that there used to be an older locative case, and that lingers on in this conditional. Or we could just come up with some noun that means something like event or situation or something along those lines, and then apply the locative to that, so that it would be in the event of such and such. Yeah, I think I prefer the latter option, and I think it would have to be built off of either the gerund or the first principle part. Or I guess it could actually just be the locative applied to the gerund, because that wouldn't conflict with the case marking when the gerund is just being used as a noun, because the old accusative was never applied to it. But then that would come out as like uchin, which is really similar to achin, so I think I want some more variation than that. I think I'm going to use the first principle part as the stem, just because we have used the gerund a lot, and we already have quite a few sequences with h followed by another consonant. So if we were to have a word like bu, which just meant something like situation or event or happening, something along those lines, and that would be the first principle part, plus bu in the locative, which would come out as bin, which with vowel harmony would just become an underspecified high vowel. And then the nasal in the first principle part would assimilate to the b. So most of the time it would come out as like imbun, which is pretty good. So we have our conditional converb, and I think most of the time it will be paired with the conditional tense aspect mood combo, but not always, because depending on which tense you combine it with, that could have certain implications for the likelihood or certainty of the action. And there are all sorts of very subtle shades of meaning that go into conditionals. Like if you say, if it weren't going to rain, I would see my friend today. And that gets across that the idea that it's not going to rain is a very remote possibility. It's pretty much guaranteed to rain, and therefore seeing my friend is an entirely imaginary, counterfactual state of affairs. Whereas if you say, if it doesn't rain today, then I will see my friend, then that sets it up as being more of an actual possibility of something that might happen. So we've already made a note that using the potential along with the conditional can convey a counterfactual, and that using the obligative along with the conditional conveys a sense of should. Not as in an optative should, because there's a separate affix for that, but instead a should of to be indebted to do something. So just with all of the morphology we already have, we can get across quite a lot of variation in conditionals, and I think any further nuances will just come up naturally in translation. So that being the case, I am going to go ahead and cross off conditionals, which means that the only thing we have left is clause chaining. And really, when I say clause chaining, that basically just comes down to making some more converbs. Because when I originally made this list, I wasn't really sure how dependent we were going to be on converbs. Like, we obviously had the principal parts, which were our main converbs, but beyond those, I wasn't really sure what other sort of subordination strategies we would have. But at this point, I'm pretty sold on the idea of just going full converb, because I just love converbs and they're just so amazingly convenient. So really, the only question remains how many and what types of converbs do we want to have? Well, one that immediately springs to mind that came up earlier is a resultative. Also want an instrumental, and maybe a manner converb too, although we could definitely say that the manner is the same as the instrumental. Like, I whitened the fence by painting it could just be the same as I whitened the fence in a painting manner. Not really very much that needs to be distinguished between them. And those are all the main ones that come to mind. Let's start with the instrumental, because I think that'll be pretty straightforward, because as you might expect, instrumental converbs very often come from instrumental cases. Now, we don't have an instrumental case, but we do have an instrumental postposition, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, we have this word sar, which means by means of, so all we'd have to do is just stick that on the end of the gerund. And I think it would have to be the gerund, because it wouldn't really make sense to use the first principal part since that's already an adpositional phrase. So that would come out as like uchsar. which is okay, but it is pretty similar to just the normal forms of the gerund, and I really don't want to overuse that "ch" ending. And I don't want to use the same trick that I used with the concessive to say that the H disappears, and the palatal turns into a Y, because ultimately that would just turn into "ur", which looks identical to the second principal part. Or another idea I just had, and another pretty common way these things get derived, if we have a word for a way or a path, which we have here because we used it to come up with our word for how. What path or what way did something happen? So if we had a construction like "in the way of such and such," so if we put yaku in the locative, then that would come out ultimately as yakan. And if we say that got attached to the gerund, ushakan, it's quite an ending. If the H disappears and the U melds with the Y to become U, the stress is on the A. I guess over time the E might be strong enough to influence the stressed A, and then it would just come out as ukan. I mean, that's kind of what happened in the evolution of Spanish, with the Latin perfect ending awi, with that long stressed A, ultimately became O, because of the W that was next to it. So I think that's doable, and I actually like that a fair bit better than uxar. So let's go with that instead, actually. And if that's the etymology we're going with, then I would have to imagine that would overlap, at least in some respect, with the manner converb, because it's literally the way or manner in which you're doing something. So yeah, the more I think about it, the more I think we don't really need a separate manner converb. I'll scratch that off. Okay, so the resultative. How are we going to do the resultative? So the resultative is like, so that such and such, or in such a way that such and such. Now we already have a purposive converb, which kind of overlaps with this a little bit, because the purposive converb is in order to such and such, but the purposive is more about the intended goal rather than the consequence. Like, I painted the fence in order for it to become white, rather than I painted the fence and as a result it became white. I guess become could work. Becoming white, I painted the fence. The only issue with that is that there's no real way of telling which argument it's referring to, because again, that kind of sounds like I'm the one who's becoming white. But really that's going to be true in any converb clause, because without any person marking, it's just kind of assumed that the subject is going to carry over from one clause to the next. I'm trying to think if become would work in other contexts as well. Or, again, we could just do the same thing that we're doing for the resultative complement and just use the postposition ba. I paint the fence toward becoming white. And in that case, I think we could use the first principal part, because the ba is coming from an old verb that means to go. So it's like go to white. So our resultative and conditional would look very similar to each other, imba versus imbun, but I think that's fine. Because if we went with to become, that's this root da, which again I think would have to go on the gerund, so it would come out as like uchta. Again, I just want to get a little bit more variation in there. It occurs to me actually that if we use to become, that could also have an additional meaning, because you could say something like, becoming running, I fell over, where to become doesn't describe the result of the action, it describes the point at which the action happened. So I guess that would be like an inceptive converb, like once I started running, as opposed to the general imperfective converb, which would just be when I was running. It's specifically the initiation of the action in the converb clause that causes the action of the main clause. So I just did a bit of reading about inceptive converbs to refresh my memory, and I remember coming across this paper about Mechweb when I was doing research for the Converbs video I made, and Mechweb apparently does have an inceptive converb, and interestingly, it comes from this combination of case suffixes that means from above. And I guess this goes back to like Worfian stuff of how a culture views the concept of time. Because if time goes down, then if you're just starting an action, you'll be on top of it or above it. So in this example, a year has passed since I sent the letter. So the equivalent of that, if we were to go with this become idea, becoming sending the letter, a year has passed. That doesn't really seem congruous to me. The second example is a bit better, because from the moment he came back, he was laughing. Becoming coming back, he was laughing. Wait a second. if we use exactly the same construction as we do up here for our simultaneous / consecutive, if we take the old word acha, which means instant or moment, and then just put the old genitive suffix, which originally had the meaning of from, then we would have from the moment of. But is that actually any different than the consecutive? Because the consecutive is at the moment from, whereas for an inceptive that would be from the moment at. Well, if we did do that, then the suffix would be achsu, and I'm pretty sure that would go with the first principle part, because it's the moment at which something happens. I can't decide if I like that or not. It does kind of fall out quite naturally from everything we've done so far. We'll throw it in for now, but that makes me wonder, if there's an inceptive converb, is there also a terminative converb? So like, up until such and such. I mean, we do have a word for until. We could just stick that onto a verb stem if we wanted, because that comes from an old verb that means to reach. But this form wouldn't really reduce very much. It would pretty much always come out as just a korot suffix, which would be very obviously and transparently related to the word for until, which I don't love. Whereas we do have this other word that means to arrive, so like arriving at such and such. So I kept painting the fence until it was white would be I kept painting the fence arriving at being white. And that would pretty much always come out as just a na suffix, which would go on, I think, the first principle part, in which case the suffix would be inna. So I'm going through some papers about converbs to get some inspiration, and I'm reading through this paper, which, again, I remember reading through when I was doing research for the Converbs video, and lo and behold, I come across this posterior converb in Evenki that has the form, I kid you not, knan. Anyone who watches Langtime Studio will get a kick out of that, but based on the example, it can convey a terminative meaning, but it also explicitly says that it can be used as a resultative as well. And yeah, it's pretty easy to see how those two overlap. So if we run with this and say that our terminative can also function as a kind of resultative, do we keep the other resultative as well, and just say that they're used in subtly different contexts? Or do we get rid of this resultative and just wrap it all up into the terminative? I mean, I can definitely think of situations in which using one or the other would have quite different meanings, like, I'm going to keep working until I get tired, is quite different from, I'm going to keep working so that I become tired. So I think it's probably safer to keep both of them. Well, going with that for the time being, it also occurs to me that we do have an anterior converb. In fact, we have multiple ways of describing anteriority, because we've got the third principal part, which is having done such and such, which is basically anterior, and then we've got this causal converb that can also be used anteriorly. I think I've actually got this screwed up. The causal overlaps with the posterior, because afterwards is posterior, before is anterior. So we do have a posterior converb, but we do not have an anterior converb, so perhaps we should make one of those. So one option that immediately springs to mind is to use to lead, which would parallel using to follow for the posterior, and we do have a word for to lead that's giving us the associative causative prefix. And I think I forgot to mention this last episode, but I decided that the ordinal for the number 1, so the word first, should be suppletive with the cardinal form, and I used the word for to lead for that purpose, because, you know, the first one is the leading one. And if we use this word for lead, that would actually give us a word final I, and we don't have very many of those so far, so that's very good. And I think that would have to go on the gerund. We end up with another geminate H. I think I'm okay with that, though. Okay, so that is a pretty robust set of 10 converbs. I'm trying to think if there's any more I might want to add. So I just had a look through a bunch of papers just for some more inspiration, just in case I came across any other converbs that took my fancy. And in this paper on Korean converbs, they cited this paper on adverbial clauses. And in this paper, they claim that there are 12 basic types of adverbial subordination. And I went through and read the paper, and I think we have ways of covering basically all of these. Not to say that we have separate converbs for all of them, but there will be strategies for dealing with each of these. Like location, for example, conceivably, we could have a locative converb that basically means where such and such happens. The only one of these that I don't think we have a strategy for dealing with at the moment that might be fun to have a separate converb form for is what they call the substitutive, which is basically instead of such and such. But again, I don't feel like this language that we're working on needs too many specialized converbial forms. Like, I want to keep the system relatively simple. So I think this set of 10 gives us a fine arsenal. I'll probably have some more ideas before the next episode, but until then, I am going to mark clause chaining as done. In which case, we have done everything that we needed to do today. Wow, that didn't take nearly as long as I thought it would. And since we're not pressed for time, I think I'm going to go ahead and coin a new word while we're at it. Because it just struck me at some point relatively recently that this language does not yet have a word for many, which is a pretty ubiquitous adjective. Now, I'm mindful of the fact that next episode we're going to be going through all of these adjectival stems and sorting them into different declension classes, so it would be good if I could find one that we're missing. If the root ended in L, then in the inanimate, when it takes the I ending, that would cause the L to palatalize, and then later on the y between vowels becomes just a y, whereas in the human and animate classes it will just remain as an L. I'm trying to settle on an initial consonant, and I really want to use the uvula, and the only thing that's stopping me is we already have this word for large that would look quite similar. Kara versus kala. I don't know, it's a little bit close. But hey, maybe we could say that they are cognates. Maybe this ka in the proto-lang comes from some word that just meant a large quantity of something, so it could get across the meaning of both size and quantity. Actually, in the human and the animate, they should both have geminates. Okay, so we've got three forms, kala, kala, and kai. You know, I think that same alternation with the coda L would also actually happen up here with these other words. So it should be like ni and e. I'm going to have to look into that next episode. The dative human plural is terrible. 3 long vowels and a geminate. It occurs to me, does it even make sense to have a dual form of the word many? Like the many two of something? I guess if you're using the dual in the sense of pairs of things, like the many pairs of shoes. I guess? Oh well, I'll make them just to be sure. Okay, so those are all the forms, and now for the example sentence. So the example sentence should probably include the word many that we've just coined. Should probably also involve at least one person clitic, and it should have as many of our converb forms as we can conceivably fit in. Also a resultative and or depictive. It would be cool if we could have both forms of adjectival resultative construction, both using the postposition and then also using the become suffix in the converb form. If we go with a phrase like, to strike dead. So who is being struck dead? Well, for at least one of the arguments we're going to be using a person clitic, probably the direct object, and probably third person. We could use the verb that means to defeat, and then put the resultative phrase in an instrumental / manner clause. So it's like defeating by striking dead. Oh, I forgot, we should really include a conditional in there as well. We also have this word for to cut. Oh, hold on, I think I've got it. Although there are many strong people in the city, so that's a concessive, if anyone tries to fight the chief, then before they can strike him, he will defeat them by cutting them dead, or cutting them until they die. We could use a terminative for that as well. Okay, I don't know why I've written this backwards. Alright, let's go through this clause by clause. So, although there are many strong people in the city, the verb is there are, which is the locative copula, and that needs to be in the concessive. So we take the second principal part, drop off the R, replace it with NTA, but the concessive will cause umlaut, so it would come out as hinute, so that's although there exist many strong people. Wow, apparently I do not yet have a generic word for person, I only have a word for man and woman. Well, that's very damning. Well, note to self to rectify that next time, but for now, what we can do is to just use men and women in a coordinating construction. So the word for men in the nominative plural is dolor, and the word for woman is sadar. So men and women, we need lch, and since women begins with an S, the H would cause gemination. So now there's many. So the nominative plural in the human class for many, and then same for the word for strong, and then in the city. So that is the locative form of city, which is the same as the nominative, and then the word vet, which is within. Okay, now the second clause, the verb is to try. So to form the conditional converb, take the first principal part, and then add the ben suffix. So sirvamben is if trying. Now we have our word for anyone, which is rymy, and that's in the nominative. Okay, to fight the chief. Okay, I slightly misremembered. I thought we had a word for to fight. We have an old word that means to fight, but it's ameliorated to mean just to deal with. But if we just kind of pretend that it can still mean to fight, then this is a situation where we'd use the gerund. So we remove the final R and replace it with an H, and it is the accusative, because it's the thing that's being tried. So we stick on the accusative ending. But then the chief is the accusative of the fighting. And chief in the accusative. If anyone tries to fight the chief, then before they can strike him, we take the second principal part of to strike, and then add the ending high. So that's before striking, and this is where we use the person clitic. They're striking him, so it would be the human singular. The S would roticize, so it would just be tar, which does look a lot like the passive now that I think about it. The only difference between a passive and a third-person object prefix would be whether or not that R is geminated. I realize now I subconsciously snuck in a potential into this clause before they can strike him. I don't think our potential suffix can actually go on converbs. I'm going to need to think about that. I guess maybe it could? Either that, or there could be some independent word that means to be able to, that's used in converb clauses. Well, that's one to think about before next episode. I'm just going to completely dodge the question this time round and just get rid of it. Okay, and then after all that, we finally get to our finite verb clause. He will defeat them. Now, the way we've phrased the English, we've used the future tense. If anyone fights the chief, he will defeat them. So this suggests that this is a turn of events that could potentially happen. Whereas if we were to use the conditional tense, that would be like, if someone were to fight him, he would defeat them. As if this hasn't happened before and is not likely to happen. I'll go ahead and use the conditional tense because we haven't actually used it very often before this point. So the conditional is form 4 combined with the first principal part. So the first principal part is amban, and that's combined with the human singular in form 4, vahan. Then we need another object clitic, and this one is also human singular, and again it would roticize, so it would just come out as tar. Now, there's a little bit of an issue of anaphora going on here, because we've got two third-person participants. Both of them are in the human singular, so I guess you might just have to restate the noun here. Yeah, I can't really think of any other way around it. But that's not really a big deal. That sort of thing comes up cross-linguistically all the time. Just leave it up to context. So he will defeat them by cutting them. So we need the instrumental / manner, take the second principal part of to cut, and then we add the object clitic again, and for the first time, the S does not roticize, and we apply vowel harmony, and I think that would still come before the finite verb clause, just in the spirit of clause chaining. Okay, and then cutting them dead. So we have two options for this. We could use the adjective for dead, which is v, stick it in front of the verb, and then put the postposition ba after it. So that's like, by cutting them to death. Or we could use a terminative converb construction. So the terminative / resultative has the first principal part plus na, so that's so that they die. And at this point, there's no way to clarify who's the one that's dying, other than just using an overt noun, but that's okay. I feel like I've probably made a few mistakes in this one, but to the best of my ability at the moment, the final sentence would be, Imrafod kallar baradir dolor sadar hinunta, rumi itvalkes nurhissusirvamben, tarakuchai testisukun vennovahan taramban. Okay, that'll do it for today. Thanks very much for tuning in, and next time, other than probably touching up the grammar in one or two other little places, the main task of the next episode will be sorting out our declension and conjugation classes, which will hopefully be the final episode of working out this language's grammar before moving on to the writing system. So tune back in for that in hopefully not too long, and I look forward to seeing you then.